Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers, where deep ideas meet restful nights. If you enjoy these journeys through philosophy, please like and subscribe and turn on notifications for daily uploads. To support the channel, consider leaving a super thanks. Any amount helps us continue creating content. You can also become a member to request video topics. We're not monetized, so your support truly makes the difference. Now let the philosophy begin. The lottery paradox. Imagine a fair lottery with 1 million tickets, and exactly one ticket will win, and you have not yet learned which ticket won. And now consider each individual ticket. Ticket number 1 has a 1 in a million chance of winning, which means it has a 999,999 in a million chance of losing. And this is overwhelmingly probable, so probable that it seems rational to believe that ticket 1 will not win. And the same reasoning applies to ticket 2, ticket 3, and every other ticket. Each has a minuscule chance of winning and an enormous chance of losing, and so it seems rational to believe of each ticket that it will not win. But now a problem emerges. If you believe that ticket 1 will not win, and you believe that ticket 2 will not win, and you believe this for each of the million tickets, then it seems you should believe that no ticket will win, because belief is generally thought to be closed under conjunction. If you believe P and you believe Q, then you should believe P and Q. And by repeated application of this principle, if you believe of each ticket that it will not win, then you should believe that none of them will win. But you also know with certainty that exactly one ticket will win. This is a stipulated fact of the lottery, and so you believe both that no ticket will win and that some ticket will win. And these beliefs are contradictory, and so you hold contradictory beliefs, which seems paradigmatically irrational. Yet each individual belief, the belief that ticket 1 will not win, the belief that ticket 2 will not win, and so on, seems perfectly rational, justified by the overwhelming probability. And so the lottery paradox forces a choice between accepting that rational belief can be inconsistent, rejecting closure of belief under conjunction, or denying that high probability is sufficient for rational belief. The paradox was articulated by Henry Kaiberg in the 1960s, and it has generated an enormous literature in epistemology with various proposed solutions and no clear consensus. And the paradox reveals deep tensions in our ordinary thinking about belief, knowledge, probability, and rationality. Tensions that cannot be easily resolved without giving up some cherished principles or intuitions. One response is to reject closure, to argue that rational belief is not closed under conjunction, that you can rationally believe each of many propositions without rationally believing all of them together, especially when the propositions are probabilistic and the number of them is large. And this response aligns with the observation that the probability of a conjunction is the product of the probabilities of the conjuncts. And so even if each ticket has only a 1 in a million chance of winning, the probability that at least one ticket wins is certainty. And so there is a gap between the high probability of each individual proposition and the low probability of their conjunction. And this gap justifies believing each individual proposition while not believing their conjunction. Another response is to raise the threshold for rational belief, to argue that high probability is not sufficient for belief, that belief requires something stronger, perhaps near certainty or probability, above some higher threshold, like 99% or 99.9%. And if we raise the threshold high enough, then it will no longer be rational to believe of each ticket that it will not win, because the probability that it will not win, while high, is not high enough to meet the raised threshold. And so the paradox dissolves, because the initial premise that it is rational to believe of each ticket that it will not win is rejected. A third response distinguishes between degrees of belief or credence and full belief, arguing that we should assign high credence to the proposition that ticket 1 will not win, perhaps 99.9999%, but we should not fully believe it. And full belief is reserved for propositions that meet a higher standard, perhaps certainty or near certainty. And this response preserves the intuition that high probability matters for rationality, while avoiding the paradox by denying that high probability justifies full belief. Still another response embraces a kind of rational inconsistency, arguing that in certain situations it is rational to hold inconsistent beliefs, that consistency is not an absolute requirement of rationality, that the world is complex and uncertain, and our beliefs must reflect that uncertainty, even if it means tolerating some inconsistency. And this response aligns with the preface paradox, where an author rationally believes each claim in a book while rationally believing that not. All the claims are true, and both paradoxes suggest that closure of belief under conjunction is too strong a requirement, that it demands a kind of logical perfection that finite agents in uncertain environments cannot achieve. The lottery paradox also connects to debates about the nature of knowledge, because it seems clear that you do not know that ticket 1 will not win, even though you have excellent evidence for believing it. And this suggests that knowledge requires something more than justified true belief, perhaps a safety condition, the requirement that in nearby possible worlds where you believe PP is true, and in the lottery case there are nearby worlds where the lottery is run fairly and ticket 1 wins, in which your belief that ticket 1 will not win is false, and so your belief fails the safety condition and does not constitute knowledge, even if it happens to be true. The paradox has practical implications as well, because we constantly make decisions based on beliefs that have high but not maximal probability. We believe that the plane will not crash, that the medicine will work, that the bridge will not collapse, and in each case there is a small probability that our belief is false. Yet we act on these beliefs. We board the plane, take the medicine, cross the bridge, and if we refuse to believe or act on anything less than certainty, we would be paralyzed, unable to function in a world of uncertainty. And so, the lottery paradox is not merely an abstract puzzle, but a reflection of the epistemic situation we constantly face, the need to navigate between skepticism and credulity, between demanding too much certainty and accepting too little, between the logical ideal of perfect consistency and the practical necessity of acting on incomplete information. The million tickets sit in the urn, one will win, the others will lose, and reason seems to say both that we should believe of each that it will lose, and that we should not believe that all will lose. And this contradiction, or apparent contradiction, has no easy resolution, no solution that preserves all intuitions and principles. And so the paradox remains a permanent challenge to theories of rational belief, a puzzle that forces philosophers to clarify what they mean by belief, by rationality, by justification, and to acknowledge that our ordinary concepts, when pressed to their limits, reveal inconsistencies and tensions that may be ineliminable features of finite cognition rather than problems to be solved. And the lottery continues, the tickets are drawn, one wins, the others lose, and we believe what we must believe, what rationality seems to demand, even when those beliefs, taken together, lead to contradiction. And the paradox endures, a monument to the gap between logical perfection and epistemic reality, between what we ought to believe in principle and what we must believe in practice. The liar paradox. There exists a statement so simple that it collapses the foundations of truth itself, a sentence that devours its own meaning the moment it is spoken. And this is the liar paradox, a loop that has haunted logicians and philosophers for over 2,000 years. The paradox is most famously expressed in a single declaration: this statement is false, and the mind recoils at what follows. For if the statement is true, then it must be false as it claims. But if it is false, then it must be true because it correctly identifies itself as false. And so the cycle begins again, spiraling endlessly, without resolution, without escape. The ancient Greeks were the first to wrestle with this demon of language, and Epimenides, the Cretan, is often credited with an early version when he declared that all Cretans are liars, which implies that if he himself is a Cretan, then his statement must be a lie, which means Cretans might actually tell the truth, which means his statement might be true, which means it is false again, and the contradiction churns without mercy. Philosophers have spent centuries trying to solve or dissolve the paradox, and some argue that self-referential statements like this are simply meaningless, that language breaks down when it tries to refer to itself in this way, while others suggest that truth is not binary but exists on a spectrum, allowing for statements that are neither fully true nor fully false, hovering in some undefined space between. Bertrand Russell encountered similar contradictions when developing set theory and discovered that self-reference could destroy the entire logical framework of mathematics, leading him to create new systems that carefully excluded paradoxes like the liar from ever forming. The paradox also influenced Kurt Gödel, whose incompleteness theorems proved that within any sufficiently complex logical system, there will always be true statements that cannot be proven, which itself echoes the spirit of the liar paradox, the idea that truth and provability are not always the same thing. Some modern logicians have proposed paraconsistent logics, systems where contradictions can exist without causing the entire structure to collapse, allowing the liar paradox to be true and false simultaneously without forcing us to accept that everything is true, which would render logic useless. Others reject the paradox entirely, claiming that natural language is too vague and imprecise to support rigorous logical analysis, that the liar paradox is a quirk of grammar rather than a deep philosophical problem. Yet the paradox persists, refusing to die, surfacing in new forms across disciplines, from computer science to legal theory, anywhere that self-reference appears. Consider a sign that reads, "Ignore this sign," or a rule that states there are no rules, or a person who says everything I say is a lie, and the same strange loop emerges, the same dizzying collapse of meaning. The liar paradox forces confrontation with the limits of language, logic, and truth itself, suggesting that reality may not always fit neatly into categories of true and false, that some truths may be inherently unstable, slipping through the fingers the moment they are grasped. It reminds us that words are not perfect mirrors of reality, but tools shaped by human thought, and sometimes those tools turn on themselves, revealing cracks in the structures we build to make sense of existence. The knower paradox. There exists a peculiar sentence that seems to lead directly to contradiction, and this sentence states the knower is not known. And the question arises, is this sentence true or false? And both options lead to trouble, creating what is known as the knower paradox, a puzzle in epistemic logic that reveals tensions between knowledge, truth, and self-reference. Suppose the sentence "the knower is not known" is true. Then by definition of what the sentence says, the fact that the knower is not known is itself not known. It is a truth that escapes knowledge, but if this is a truth, then it is knowable. There is nothing incoherent about knowing that something is not known. We know many facts of the form. Nobody knows X. We know that nobody knows the exact number of grains of sand on all the Earth's beaches, and so if the knower is not known is true, then someone could know it. But if someone knows it, then they know that the knower is not known, which means the knower, the fact that the knower is not known, is now known. And this contradicts the content of the sentence, which states that this fact is not known. And so assuming the sentence is true leads to contradiction. Suppose instead that the sentence is false, then its negation is true, which means the knower is known, which means someone knows that the knower is not known. But if someone knows this, then the knower, the proposition that the knower is not known, is indeed not known becomes known. And so the sentence is true after all. And again, contradiction emerges. And so neither assuming the sentence is true, nor assuming it is false, leads to a consistent outcome, and the paradox resists resolution through ordinary logical means. The knower paradox is related to the liar paradox and other self-referential semantic paradoxes, but it involves knowledge rather than truth, and it shows that knowledge, like truth, cannot be fully captured within a single, consistent formal system, without restrictions. That self-reference combined with epistemic notions generates instability, and the paradox has implications for epistemic logic, the formal study of knowledge and belief, because standard epistemic logics treat knowledge as a modality, a sentential operator that applies to propositions. And these logics typically assume that knowledge is factive. If you know P, then P is true. And that knowledge is transparent. If you know P, then you know that you know P. And these principles, which seem innocuous, interact with self-reference to produce paradoxes like the knower. One response to the knower paradox is to restrict self-reference, to prohibit sentences that refer to their own knowability status, much like Tarski's hierarchy of languages prohibits sentences that refer to their own truth. And on this approach, the knower is not known is not a genuine sentence, not a proposition with a truth value, but a piece of ill-formed language that violates the rules of proper semantic construction. And while this response avoids contradiction, it does so at the cost of limiting what can be said, of ruling out sentences that seem grammatically and conceptually well-formed. And it leaves open the question of why these restrictions should be imposed, whether they reflect genuine features of knowledge or are merely technical devices to preserve consistency. Another response distinguishes between levels of knowledge, perhaps first-order knowledge about the world, second-order knowledge about knowledge, third-order knowledge about knowledge of knowledge, and so on, and argues that the knower paradox conflates these levels, that the knower is not known involves a sentence referring to its own knowability at the same level, and that this is illegitimate, that knowledge statements must be stratified into a hierarchy where knowledge at one level can only apply to propositions at lower levels, and this hierarchical approach mirrors solutions to the liar paradox and other semantic paradoxes, but it raises questions about whether ordinary knowledge attributions respect such hierarchies, whether in natural language we freely mix levels of knowledge without contradiction, and whether imposing hierarchies is a genuine solution or merely a way of avoiding the problem. Some philosophers embrace paraconsistent logic, systems that allow contradictions to exist without trivializing the entire system, without forcing the conclusion that everything is true. And in paraconsistent frameworks, the knower paradox can be true and false simultaneously. The sentence can be both known and not known, and the contradiction is tolerated rather than resolved, contained within the logical system without spreading. And while this approach is radical, it has the advantage of taking the paradox at face value, of not dismissing it as ill-formed or illegitimate, but recognizing it as revealing something genuine about the limits of consistent reasoning about knowledge. The knower paradox also connects to issues about the closure of knowledge under known entailment. The principle that if you know P and you know that P entails Q, then you know Q, because this principle, combined with the factivity of knowledge and certain assumptions about self-knowledge, can be used to derive paradoxes, and some epistemologists have questioned whether closure should be unrestricted, whether there are cases where you know P and know that P entails Q but do not know Q, perhaps because Q is a complicated consequence that you have not worked out, or because Q involves self-referential or paradoxical content that resists knowledge. The paradox raises questions about the transparency of knowledge, the principle that if you know P then you know that you know P, because this principle, known as the KK principle, is controversial. Some argue that it is too strong, that there are cases where you know something without knowing that you know it, perhaps because you're not introspectively aware of your knowledge, or because the recognition of knowledge requires second-order reflection that you have not performed. And if the KK principle is rejected, then some versions of the knower paradox may be blocked because the reasoning depends on assumptions about what is knowable given what is known. The knower paradox sits alongside other epistemic paradoxes, the surprise examination paradox, Fitch's paradox, Moore's paradox, each revealing different tensions in our concepts of knowledge and belief, each challenging the assumption that these concepts can be fully formalized without residue, and together they suggest that knowledge is a more complex and less tractable notion than it appears, that self-reference and knowledge do not mix well, that there are limits to what can be known or consistently said about knowledge, and that the project of epistemic logic, while valuable, must navigate carefully around paradoxes that threaten its foundations. The sentence "the knower is not known" hangs in conceptual space, neither comfortably true nor comfortably false, a knot that logic cannot untie, a puzzle that resists the tools we use to solve puzzles, and it reminds us that language and thought contain traps, that self-reference is dangerous, that some sentences generate contradictions not because they are meaningless, but because they expose the limits of our logical systems, the boundaries where consistency breaks down and paradox takes over, and the knower paradox remains, a thorn in the side of epistemic logic, a challenge to anyone who claims to understand what knowledge is and how it operates. And the question persists: is the knower known or unknown? And the answer, whatever it is, leads to contradiction, and the paradox endures, unresolved and perhaps unresolvable, a permanent fixture in the landscape of philosophical puzzles, a reminder that even knowledge itself, the concept at the heart of epistemology, contains mysteries that philosophy has not yet fathomed. The ladder paradox: how moving objects shrink and fit where they shouldn't. A ladder 10 meters long rushes toward a garage that is only 8 meters deep. The garage has a front door and a back door, both initially open, and the ladder is traveling at a significant fraction of the speed of light, fast enough that length contraction becomes important. And according to special relativity objects moving at high speed contract along their direction of motion, and an observer standing in the garage watching the ladder approach calculates that at 80% of light speed the ladder contracts to 6 meters, shorter than the garage, and so the observer plans to trap the ladder inside by simultaneously closing both doors for a brief moment, catching the entire contracted ladder inside the 8-meter garage. And this seems straightforward. The moving ladder fits because it is contracted, but now consider the perspective of someone riding on the ladder. In their reference frame, the ladder is at rest and maintains its full 10-meter length, while the garage is moving toward them at 80% of light speed, and so the garage contracts to less than 5 meters deep, far too small to contain the 10-meter ladder, and the person on the ladder knows that the front of the ladder will exit the back door before the back of the ladder enters the front door, and trapping the ladder inside is impossible, and so the two observers disagree about whether the ladder fits inside the garage, whether both doors can be closed simultaneously with the ladder inside. And this is the ladder paradox, also called the barn pole paradox, a puzzle about how length contraction and simultaneity interact in special relativity. The resolution lies in understanding that simultaneity is relative, that events which are simultaneous in one reference frame are not simultaneous in another, and the garage observer sees both doors closing at the same time, trapping the ladder, but the ladder observer sees the doors closing at different times. The front door closes first, then the back door closes later, and in the ladder frame, the sequence of events is as follows. The front of the ladder, still 10 meters away from the back of the ladder, enters the contracted garage and immediately exits the back door, and only after the entire ladder has passed through the garage does the back door close, followed by the front door closing, and so in the ladder frame, the ladder never fits entirely inside the garage. It is always longer than the garage, but the doors are never closed simultaneously with the ladder inside, and this removes the contradiction. Both observers agree on the physical facts. They agree on when collisions occur, on whether the ladder gets scratched or damaged, but they disagree about which events are simultaneous, about the order in which certain events happen, and this disagreement is not a matter of illusion or observation delay, but a fundamental feature of space-time in special relativity. Imagine space-time diagrams for both perspectives. In the garage frame, the diagram shows the two doors as vertical lines, fixed in position, and the ladder as a diagonal streak, moving horizontally through space and vertically through time. And the ladder is shortened by length contraction. And there is a moment when the back of the ladder has entered the front door, and the front of the ladder has not yet exited the back door. And at this moment, both doors can be closed simultaneously, trapping the contracted ladder. And in the ladder frame, the diagram shows the ladder as two vertical lines, the front and back of the ladder stationary, and the garage as a moving object, contracted along the direction of motion. And the two doors close at different times. First, the front door closes and then opens, allowing the front of the ladder to pass. And then the back door closes after the back of the ladder has already entered. And the doors are never simultaneously closed around the ladder, and both descriptions are correct. Both are consistent with the laws of physics, and the apparent contradiction arises only from expecting that simultaneous in one frame means simultaneous in all frames. And relativity denies this. Simultaneity is frame-dependent. The paradox also highlights the role of signals and information, because if the closing of the doors is controlled by signals sent at the speed of light, then the relativity of simultaneity ensures that the signals arrive at different times in different frames, and the physical mechanism that closes the doors respects causality and relativity, and no contradiction arises. The doors can be set to close when the ladder is inside, as measured in the garage frame, and this same mechanism, viewed from the ladder frame, closes the doors at different times, and the ladder is never trapped because it never fits entirely inside, and both descriptions are correct and consistent. Some people find this resolution unsatisfying. It seems like the ladder either fits or does not fit. There should be an objective fact of the matter, but relativity says that fits inside is not an objective notion. When motion is involved, it depends on what simultaneity convention is used, on which reference frame is chosen, and different frames can disagree about spatial relationships without any frame being wrong. And this is one of the deepest lessons of relativity, that spatial and temporal relationships are frame-dependent, that there is no absolute space or absolute time, and that what counts as simultaneous or as fitting inside depends on the observer's state of motion. The ladder paradox has practical analogues in particle physics, where particles travelling at relativistic speeds appear contracted in the laboratory frame. And this contraction affects how they interact with detectors, how they traverse magnetic fields, and how their collisions are modelled. And physicists routinely account for length contraction and time dilation in analysing experiments. And the paradoxical features of relativity are not mere thought experiments, but daily realities in accelerator laboratories. Visualise the ladder streaking toward the garage, its atoms compressed along the direction of motion. The electromagnetic forces between atoms adjusted by the motion, creating a physically shorter object in the garage frame, and the garage rushing toward the ladder in the ladder frame, compressed to a narrow slit, and the ladder threading through this slit without ever being contained. And both pictures are correct, both are consistent, and the paradox dissolves once simultaneity is properly understood, once it is accepted that different observers experience different orderings of spatially separated events, and the ladder paradox remains a teaching tool, an illustration of how length contraction and relativity of simultaneity work together, how apparent contradictions in relativity are resolved by careful analysis of reference frames, and how our intuitions about space and time, trained on low-speed everyday experience, fail completely when speeds approach that of light, and the ladder passes through, contracted or not, trapped or not, depending on who you ask, depending on what frame you occupy, and the paradox endures as a reminder that space and time are not what they seem. That motion affects not just how we measure things, but what length and simultaneity mean, and that Einstein's revolution was not just about equations, but about reconceiving the very fabric of reality. The infinite shadow paradox, when your shadow could cover the universe. Imagine standing in a bright room with a light source behind you, casting your shadow on the wall in front of you, and the shadow is roughly your size, perhaps slightly larger, depending on the distance between you and the light. And now imagine moving the light farther and farther away, keeping it directly behind you. And as the light moves back, your shadow grows larger, stretching taller and wider on the wall, because the light rays diverge more gradually, creating a bigger shadow. And if you continue this process, moving the light farther and farther away, your shadow continues to grow. And now the question emerges: what happens if the light source is infinitely far away? If the light comes from an infinite distance, does your shadow become infinitely large? Does it stretch across the entire wall, the entire room, the entire planet, the entire universe? And if so, what does this mean? How can your finite body cast an infinite shadow? And this is the infinite shadow paradox, a thought experiment that reveals tensions between geometry, infinity, and the behavior of light. Consider the geometry more carefully. When the light is close behind you, the light rays that graze the top of your head and the light rays that graze your feet diverge at a large angle, creating a shadow that is only slightly larger than your body. But as the light moves farther away, the angle between these rays decreases. The rays become more nearly parallel, and the shadow grows proportionally. And in the limiting case where the light is infinitely far away, the rays become perfectly parallel, and the shadow, if it still makes sense to talk about a shadow, is no longer a finite shape on a surface, but an infinite column of darkness extending forever in the direction away from the light. And your body blocks a certain solid angle of light, a cone of rays, and when the light is infinitely far away, this cone becomes a cylinder, extending infinitely. And so, in some sense, your shadow has become infinite. It covers an infinite region of space. But there is something strange about this conclusion, because in reality, when light comes from very far away, like sunlight which travels from the sun 93 million miles distant, shadows are sharp and well-defined, not infinite. And the reason is that even though the sun is very far away, it is not infinitely far. And more importantly, the sun is not a point source. It is an extended object, a sphere, and light comes from every point on the sun's surface. And these different light sources create slightly different shadows that overlap. And the overlapping softens the edges and prevents the shadow from extending infinitely. And so the paradox relies on an idealization, a perfectly point-like light source at infinite distance. And this idealization does not correspond to physical reality. And so the infinite shadow is a feature of the idealized model rather than a genuine physical phenomenon. Another way to resolve the paradox is to recognize that the concept of a shadow depends on there being a surface on which the shadow is cast, a wall or a floor or the ground. And if the light is infinitely far away and there is no surface, then there is no shadow in the usual sense. There is a region of space from which light is blocked, but without a surface to project onto. The notion of shadow loses its meaning, and so the infinite shadow is not a shadow at all, but an abstract geometric construction, a cylinder of blocked light extending through space. And whether this deserves to be called a shadow or an infinitely large shadow is a matter of definition rather than a physical fact. The paradox also connects to questions about parallel lines and perspective, because in ordinary experience, parallel lines appear to converge at a vanishing point on the horizon. Train tracks appear to meet in the distance, even though they remain the same distance apart. And this convergence is a feature of perspective, of how our eyes or cameras project three-dimensional space onto two-dimensional images. But in the case of light rays coming from infinity, the rays are truly parallel, not merely appearing parallel, and parallel lines by definition never meet, extend forever without intersecting. And so the shadow, defined as the region blocked by your body from these parallel rays, is a cylinder that extends infinitely. And there is no convergence, no finite boundary. And the paradox is that this seems to make your small body relevant to arbitrarily distant regions of space, seems to give your finite physical present's infinite geometric reach. Some philosophers have used the infinite shadow paradox to argue about the nature of infinity and the limits of physical realizability, suggesting that infinite quantities like infinite distance or infinite extension cannot actually occur in the physical universe, that they are useful mathematical idealizations, but not genuine features of reality. And the paradox supports this view by showing that infinite idealizations lead to strange consequences that do not match experience. And so, perhaps infinity is a tool for calculation rather than a description of the actual world. And the paradox is avoided by rejecting the premise that light can come from infinite distance, or that shadows can extend infinitely. Others embrace the paradox as revealing something genuine about geometry and light, accepting that in an idealized geometric setting, with a point source at infinity and parallel rays, shadows do become infinite. And this is not a contradiction, but a feature of how geometry works, and the fact that physical light sources are extended and finite distances are never truly infinite means that the paradox does not apply to real shadows, but it remains a valid thought experiment about what would happen in an idealized limit. And such thought experiments are valuable for understanding the structure of space and the behavior of light, even if they do not correspond to observable phenomena. Visualize yourself standing on an infinite flat plane, with a point of light infinitely far behind you, and the light rays come in perfectly parallel, and your body blocks a cylinder of these rays, and the cylinder extends forward forever. And if there were a wall anywhere in front of you, no matter how far away, your shadow would appear on that wall, and the shadow would be exactly your size, exactly your shape, because the parallel rays preserve size and shape. And so, in this sense, your shadow is not infinitely large, but infinitely long. It is a finite cross-section extended through infinite space. And whether this counts as an infinite shadow or merely an infinitely extended shadow is a question of terminology. But the strangeness remains, the fact that your finite body has infinite geometric influence. The paradox also appears in discussions of cosmology and the nature of the universe, because if the universe is infinite in spatial extent and light travels in straight lines, then in principle, a light source on one side of the universe could cast shadows of objects on the other side, and the time required for light to travel such distances would be infinite. And so the shadow would never actually form, would always be in the process of propagating, and this raises questions about whether infinite distances are meaningful, whether light travelling forever without reaching a destination is different from light that does not exist, and whether geometric constructions that invoke infinity are useful descriptions or merely mathematical artifacts. The shadow stretches forward, grows as the light recedes, and in the limit becomes infinite, a column of darkness extending without end, and you stand there, finite and small, casting a shadow that reaches to infinity. And the paradox asks whether this makes sense, whether infinite shadows are possible, whether geometry allows such things. And the answer depends on what idealizations are accepted, on whether point sources and infinite distances and perfect parallel rays are admitted. And if they are, then the shadow is infinite, and if they are not, then the paradox dissolves. And the paradox remains a teaching tool, an illustration of how infinity changes things, how limits can produce strange results, how geometric reasoning applied to idealized cases can lead to conclusions that violate intuition, and the shadow persists, stretching toward infinity, a monument to the strangeness of geometric idealizations and the care required when reasoning about the infinite. The growing argument, objects change size over time. A child grows into an adult, a sapling becomes a tree, a pebble is worn smooth by erosion, and yet we say these are the same entities, the same person, the same tree, the same stone. But if size and shape change, can identity truly remain? And this is the growing argument, sometimes called the growing block paradox, or the problem of material constitution, a puzzle about how objects can gain or lose parts while remaining numerically identical to themselves. Consider a statue made of clay, and a sculptor adds more clay to it, making it larger, and then removes some clay, making it smaller, and at each moment the statue is made of different material, occupying a different volume, and yet we call it the same statue throughout the process. But if the statue is identical to the lump of clay that constitutes it, then the statue and the clay should share all their properties. Yet the statue has properties the clay does not. The statue has aesthetic value. The statue was created at a certain time. The statue could survive minor alterations, while the clay, as a mere lump, has none of these properties. And so the statue and the clay cannot be identical, even though they occupy the same space and are made of the same material. The paradox deepens when we consider the career of the clay. The lump existed before the statue was formed, and will exist after the statue is destroyed, and so the lump and the statue have different temporal boundaries. They begin and end at different times, and if they are not identical, then there must be two objects occupying the same space at the same time, the lump and the statue. And this seems strange, an unnecessary multiplication of entities. Some philosophers embrace this conclusion, arguing that the world contains far more objects than we ordinarily recognize, that every statue is accompanied by a lump, every organism by a mass of cells, every table by a quantity of wood, and that identity is highly context-sensitive, determined by how we carve up the world conceptually rather than by objective metaphysical facts. Others reject this view, arguing that the statue and the lump are the same object considered under different descriptions, that the properties that seem different are not intrinsic properties but extrinsic or relational ones, that being a statue is a matter of how the lump is shaped and how it is regarded rather than being a separate object. The growing argument also applies to living organisms. Because a person gains and loses atoms constantly, the body grows from infancy to adulthood, shrinks in old age, yet personal identity persists. And the question arises whether the person is identical to the collection of matter that makes up their body at any given moment. And if not, then what are they? And if so, then how can they survive the replacement of that matter over time? Mereology, the study of parts and wholes, offers various theories to address these puzzles. Some argue that objects are identical if they share all the same parts at the same time, while others allow for gradual replacement, saying that identity can be maintained as long as the changes are continuous and not too drastic. And still others embrace temporal parts, arguing that objects are four-dimensional, with different temporal slices, and that the question of identity over time is really a question of whether those slices are connected in the right way. The growing argument forces confrontation with the question of what objects are, whether they are material lumps, patterns, processes, or conventional designations, whether identity is absolute or relative, whether the world contains discrete, persistent entities, or only a flux of matter temporarily arranged in stable configurations, and whether our language and concepts, which treat objects as enduring individuals, accurately reflect the structure of reality or impose a simplifying grid on something far more fluid and complex. The paradox remains unresolved, a source of ongoing debate in metaphysics, and it reminds us that growth and change, the most ordinary features of existence, conceal profound mysteries about identity, persistence, and the nature of the things that populate our world. The Galileo paradox. Galileo Galilei, in his final work Discorsi e dimostrazioni matematiche, presented a paradox about infinite quantities that anticipates later discoveries in set theory and challenges intuitions about size and comparison. And the paradox concerns the relationship between the natural numbers and the perfect squares, and Galileo observed that every natural number has a unique perfect square, obtained by multiplying the number by itself. And conversely, Every perfect square corresponds to a unique natural number, its square root. And so there is a one-to-one correspondence between the natural numbers and the perfect squares, suggesting that there are just as many perfect squares as natural numbers, and yet the perfect squares are a proper subset of the natural numbers. Most numbers are not perfect squares. 1 is a square, 2 is not, 3 is not, 4 is a square, 5 is not, and so on, with squares becoming increasingly sparse as numbers grow larger. And this suggests that there are fewer perfect squares than natural numbers. And so Galileo's paradox is that the perfect squares seem to be both equal in number to the natural numbers by virtue of the one-to-one correspondence, and fewer in number by virtue of being a proper subset. And these two conclusions contradict each other, or seem to. And Galileo concluded that the concepts of equal, greater, and less do not apply to infinite quantities, that infinity transcends these comparisons, that we cannot meaningfully say that one infinite collection is larger or smaller than another. The paradox remained unresolved for centuries until the development of set theory by Georg Cantor in the late 19th century, and Cantor provided a systematic way to compare infinite sets, defining two sets to have the same cardinality if there exists a one-to-one correspondence between them, a bijection that pairs each element of one set with a unique element of the other. And under this definition, the natural numbers and the perfect squares have the same cardinality. Both are countably infinite. Both can be enumerated in a sequence, and the fact that the perfect squares are a proper subset of the natural numbers does not imply that they have a smaller cardinality, because infinite sets can be placed in one-to-one correspondence with proper subsets of themselves. And this property, far from being a contradiction or paradox, is the defining characteristic of infinite sets. The feature that distinguishes them from finite sets, where proper subsets always have strictly smaller cardinality. Cantor went further, showing that not all infinite sets have the same cardinality, that there is a hierarchy of infinities, that the set of real numbers is uncountably infinite, larger in a precise technical sense than the set of natural numbers. And this hierarchy extends infinitely upward, each level of infinity giving rise to larger infinities through power set constructions. And so, while Galileo's paradox shows that some infinite sets are equal in size despite one being a proper subset of the other, it does not follow that all infinite sets are equal, and the study of different sizes of infinity, of cardinal arithmetic, became a central part of set theory and mathematical logic. Galileo's paradox also raises philosophical questions about the nature of mathematical objects and the applicability of mathematics to the physical world, because if infinite sets have properties that violate finite intuitions, if the part can be equal to the whole when infinity is involved, then perhaps infinite quantities are not genuine quantities at all, but merely symbolic manipulations, mathematical fictions useful for certain purposes, but not corresponding to anything real. And this nominalist or instrumentalist view treats infinity as a convenient idealization rather than a description of actual totalities, and it sidesteps the paradox by denying that infinite collections exist, and so the paradox has no physical significance. It is merely an artifact of extending finite concepts beyond their proper domain. Others embrace the reality of infinite sets, arguing that mathematical objects exist independently of physical instantiation, that the natural numbers and the real numbers are abstract entities with determinate properties, and that Galileo's paradox reveals not a flaw in mathematics, but a truth about infinity, that infinite collections behave differently from finite collections, and that our intuitions, shaped by experience with finite quantities, must be revised when dealing with infinity. And this revision is not a retreat or a compromise, but an expansion of understanding, a recognition that reality, whether mathematical or physical, is richer and stranger than common sense suggests. The paradox also, appears in physics and cosmology, in discussions of whether the universe is spatially infinite, whether it contains infinitely many galaxies, infinitely many stars, infinitely many particles, and if so, whether these infinities can be compared, whether one infinite quantity is larger than another, and whether operations like addition or subtraction are well defined for infinite quantities. And these questions do not have obvious answers. They depend on the mathematical framework used to describe the universe, on assumptions about the structure of space-time, and on whether infinite sets in mathematics correspond to infinite collections in reality. Galileo's paradox was one of the first systematic explorations of infinity, one of the first attempts to rigorously analyze what it means for a collection to be infinite, and it anticipated many of the insights that would later be formalized in set theory, and Galileo's conclusion that the usual comparisons of size do not apply to infinite quantities was both right and wrong. Wrong in that infinite sets can be compared, and some are larger than others, but right in that infinite sets do not obey the same rules as finite sets, that the part can be equal to the whole, that addition and subtraction of infinite quantities are not straightforward, and that intuition trained on finite examples is an unreliable guide. The numbers stretch to infinity, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and among them the perfect squares, 1, 4, 9, 16, 25, sparse but infinite, and the correspondence exists, each number paired with its square, each square paired with its root, and the two collections, one a subset of the other, are equal in cardinality, equal in size, and this equality, which seems to contradict the part being smaller than the whole, is not a contradiction, but a truth about infinity, a revelation that the infinite is qualitatively different from the finite, that the rules change when quantities are unbounded, and Galileo's paradox remains a landmark, the first clear formulation of the strange properties of infinite sets, the first hint that infinity would require new mathematics, new concepts, new ways of thinking about quantity and comparison, and the paradox endures, not as a problem to be solved, but as a lesson learned, a demonstration that infinity is not a large number, but a different kind of thing entirely, and that understanding it requires abandoning intuitions that serve us well in the finite realm, but mislead us when we venture into the infinite. The free rider problem, why nobody pays for what everyone wants. A community needs a public good, needs streetlights perhaps, or clean air or national defence, and this good has a special property. It is non-excludable. Once provided, it is available to everyone, regardless of whether they contributed to its provision, and it is non-rivalrous. One person's use does not reduce availability for others. And these properties create a problem, create incentives for free riding, for enjoying the benefits without bearing the costs, and each individual reasons that their contribution is small, is negligible, will not determine whether the good is provided, and so they can free ride, can enjoy the streetlights, whether they pay or not. And since paying is costly, and the good will be provided or not, regardless of their individual contribution, it is individually rational to free ride. And if everyone reasons this way, then no one contributes. The good is not provided, and everyone is worse off than if everyone had contributed. And this is the free rider problem, a fundamental challenge in public economics, a demonstration that voluntary provision of public goods is difficult, tends toward under-provision, and solving the problem requires mechanisms that make contribution individually rational, requires collective action, requires institutions that enable groups to provide goods that individuals cannot or will not provide voluntarily. And the free rider problem explains why governments exist, why taxation is necessary, why voluntary charity is insufficient for providing public goods. And the problem remains central to political philosophy, to debates about the role of government, to questions about when collective coercion is justified. Imagine a neighbourhood deciding whether to install streetlights, and the lights would benefit everyone, would make the streets safer, would be valued by all residents. And suppose the lights cost $100 per household, and each household values the lights at $150. So collectively, the benefit exceeds the cost. Provision is efficient, but each household faces a decision: contribute or free ride. And the calculation is straightforward. If enough others contribute, the lights will be installed regardless of whether I contribute. And if I contribute, I pay $100 and get $150 of benefit for net benefits of $50. But if I free ride, I pay nothing and still get $150 of benefit for net benefits of $150. So I am better off free riding, and if not enough others contribute, then the lights will not be installed regardless of whether I contribute. And if I contribute, I pay $100 and get nothing because the lights are not installed. And if I free ride, I pay nothing and get nothing. So I am no worse off free riding, and in both cases, free riding dominates contributing. And since every household reasons this way, no one contributes, the lights are not installed, and everyone loses the net benefit they could have had. And this is the free rider problem. The free rider problem demonstrates that individual rationality can lead to collective inefficiency, that goods which everyone wants can fail to be provided because no individual has incentive to contribute, and the problem is structural, is inherent in the properties of public goods, and cannot be solved by appealing to altruism or social responsibility, because even small amounts of altruism are insufficient, because as long as some people free ride, the burden on contributors increases, and this creates resentment, undermines cooperation, and voluntary provision tends to fail. And the solution typically involves coercion, involves mandatory contributions through taxation, and governments exist partly to solve free rider problems, to provide public goods through collective funding, and taxation is justified on the grounds that it enables provision of goods that voluntary contribution cannot reliably provide. Visualize the free rider problem as a threshold public good, where the good is provided only if total contributions exceed some threshold, and individuals must decide whether to contribute without knowing whether others will contribute, and the dominant strategy is to free ride because your contribution is costly and makes little difference to whether the threshold is met, and everyone free rides. The threshold is not met. The good is not provided, and this shows why voluntary provision fails, why collective action problems arise, why coordination on contribution is difficult without institutional mechanisms. And solving the problem requires commitment devices, requires mechanisms that ensure contributions are made, that prevent free riding, and taxation is one such mechanism, makes contribution mandatory, eliminates the free riding option, and enables provision of public goods that markets fail to provide. One response to the free rider problem is Lindahl taxation, a theoretical solution where each individual pays according to their marginal benefit from the public good, pays their willingness to pay, and this makes contribution individually rational because you pay only what the good is worth to you. But Lindahl taxation faces practical problems, requires knowing each person's valuation, which people have incentive to misrepresent, have incentive to understate to reduce their tax burden, and the mechanism is not incentive compatible, is vulnerable to strategic behaviour, and cannot be implemented in practice. And so while Lindahl taxation is theoretically optimal, it does not solve the real-world free rider problem. Another response is assurance contracts, where contributions are collected conditionally, are returned if the threshold is not met. And this solves one problem with voluntary provision, eliminates the risk of contributing without the good being provided. But assurance contracts do not eliminate free riding incentive, do not make contributing dominant, because you still benefit from the good whether you contribute or not. And so assurance contracts help but do not fully solve the problem, and empirical evidence shows that contribution rates improve with assurance contracts but remain below optimal levels. A third response is social sanctions, where free riders are punished through social disapproval, through reputation loss, through exclusion from other cooperative activities, and social sanctions can support contribution in small groups where behaviour is observable, where reputation matters, where repeated interaction creates incentives for cooperation, and community provision of public goods often relies on social sanctions, relies on norms that support contribution and punish free riding. And these mechanisms can be effective in tight-knit communities but are less effective in large anonymous societies where behaviour is hard to observe and reputation effects are weak. The free rider problem also appears in debates about international cooperation, about providing global public goods like climate stability, pandemic prevention, biodiversity preservation, and these goods are non-excludable and non-rivalrous at global scale, and nations face free rider incentives, benefit from the good whether they contribute or not. And this makes international cooperation difficult, makes agreements fragile, and nations have incentive to free ride, to benefit from others' contributions while minimizing their own. And solving global free rider problems requires international institutions, requires mechanisms for monitoring and enforcement, requires ways to make contribution individually rational for nations. And the difficulty of achieving such cooperation explains why global public goods are underprovided, why climate change proceeds despite universal acknowledgement of its dangers, why pandemic preparedness is inadequate despite obvious benefits. The problem also raises philosophical questions about political obligation, about whether citizens have duties to support public goods, whether taxation is legitimate coercion or justified contribution, and libertarians argue that taxation for public goods is problematic, violates individual rights, and anarcho-capitalists argue that even genuine public goods should be provided voluntarily or not at all, while social democrats argue that taxation is justified to solve collective action problems, is necessary for provision of goods that voluntary mechanisms cannot reliably provide, and the debate turns on whether the free rider problem justifies coercion, whether preventing free riding is sufficient reason to impose mandatory contributions, and different political philosophies answer differently. Some argue that the free rider problem is overstated, that voluntary provision is more successful than theory predicts, that people do contribute to public goods despite free rider incentives. And empirical evidence supports this, shows that people do contribute voluntarily to charities, to public radio, to open source software, and contribution rates exceed zero even when free riding is possible. And this suggests that people are not purely self-interested, have preferences for fairness, for contributing to collective goods, for avoiding being seen as free riders, and behavioral economics explains these patterns through social preferences, through conditional cooperation, through warm glow effects from giving, and while voluntary provision remains below optimal levels, it is not zero, and this shows that humans are more cooperative than pure economic theory predicts. But it does not eliminate the free rider problem, does not make voluntary provision reliably sufficient, and government provision remains necessary for most public goods. The streetlights remain dark, the clean air remains polluted, the defence remains unprovided, and everyone wishes for the public good, but no one contributes. Everyone free rides, everyone waits for others to pay, and the good is not provided, and the free rider problem persists as one of the fundamental challenges in political economy, remains a justification for government, remains a reason why taxation exists, why collective provision is necessary, and the problem shows that markets fail for public goods, that voluntary mechanisms are insufficient, that individual rationality leads to collective inefficiency, and solving the problem requires institutions, requires mechanisms that make contribution mandatory, or that change incentives to make contribution rational, and without such mechanisms, public goods are underprovided. Remain goods that everyone wants but nobody provides, and the free rider problem endures. The flicker of freedom, the tiny space where choice still lives. A philosopher examines Frankfurt's counterexamples, the cases where a person acts on their own but could not have done otherwise because an intervener would have prevented any alternative. And Frankfurt argues these cases show that responsibility does not require the ability to do otherwise, that alternate possibilities are not necessary for free will. But philosopher Robert Kane and others have identified something Frankfurt missed, a detail in the structure of the cases that preserves a tiny alternative, a flicker of freedom, a moment where the person could have begun to choose differently before the intervener stopped them. And this flicker, though tiny, though insufficient to constitute full alternative action, might be enough to ground responsibility, might show that Frankfurt's cases do not actually eliminate alternatives, but only limit them. And if the flicker is necessary for responsibility, then the principle of alternate possibilities survives. Survives, in modified form, requires not robust alternatives, but only minimal alternatives, only flickers. And this is the flicker of freedom argument, the observation that Frankfurt cases contain residual alternatives, tiny spaces where choice still operates. And these flickers might be necessary and sufficient for responsibility. And the debate about Frankfurt cases becomes a debate about whether flickers matter, whether tiny alternatives count, whether responsibility requires robust alternatives or only minimal ones. And this debate has generated extensive literature, has forced refinement of Frankfurt's argument, has led to increasingly complex thought experiments designed to eliminate even flickers. And the question remains whether true flicker-free cases are possible, whether alternatives can be completely eliminated while responsibility is preserved, and the flicker of freedom persists as a challenge to Frankfurt's argument, as a defense of the principle of alternate possibilities, as a last stand for the view that responsibility requires alternatives. Imagine a Frankfurt case carefully. Jones is about to decide whether to vote for candidate A or candidate B, and Black, the intervener, has placed a device in Jones's brain that monitors his neural activity, and the device can detect which way Jones will decide before Jones becomes conscious of his decision, can detect the neural precursors of choosing B, and if the device detects these precursors, it will intervene, will alter Jones's brain to make him decide to vote for A instead. But if Jones is going to decide on his own to vote for A, then the device does nothing, remains dormant, and now suppose Jones decides on his own to vote for A. The device detects no precursors of choosing B because there are none. Jones was always going to choose A on his own, and so the device does nothing, and Jones votes for A based on his own decision. And Frankfurt says Jones is responsible, even though he could not have done otherwise. Because if he had started to choose B, the device would have intervened. And so Jones could not have voted for B, had no alternative. And yet Frankfurt says Jones is responsible, because he acted on his own, and the device played no role. But now consider the flicker. There is a moment, however brief, before the device detects that Jones is choosing B, before the device can intervene. And in that moment, Jones could have begun to choose differently, could have initiated the neural precursors that would have triggered intervention. And this moment is a genuine alternative. Is something Jones could have done differently, even though if he had done it, the device would have stopped him from completing the alternative choice. And so there is an alternative. There is something Jones could have done otherwise, namely, begin to choose B. And this alternative, though tiny, though incomplete, is a flicker of freedom. And the question is whether this flicker is sufficient to ground responsibility, whether the ability to begin an alternative is enough even if the ability to complete it is absent. Visualize freedom as coming in degrees. At one end is robust freedom, the full ability to choose and complete any available alternative. At the other end is no freedom, no alternatives whatsoever. And flickers are near the no freedom end, but not quite at it. Are minimal alternatives, are the ability to begin alternatives, even if not to complete them. And the debate is whether this minimal freedom is sufficient for responsibility, whether flickers count, or whether only robust alternatives matter. and source theorists who follow Frankfurt say flickers do not matter, say that what matters for responsibility is not alternatives but source, whether the action flows from the agent's own will, and flicker theorists who defend alternate possibilities say flickers do matter, say that responsibility requires some alternative, even if minimal, even if only a flicker. Frankfurt responded to the flicker objection by constructing more sophisticated cases, blockage cases, where the intervener does not wait for precursors but intervenes earlier, or cases where the intervener controls the entire deliberative process, ensures that only one alternative is genuinely possible psychologically, and these refined cases attempt to eliminate even flickers, attempt to create scenarios where no alternative exists at any point, not even the alternative of beginning to choose differently. And if such flicker-free cases are possible, if they preserve responsibility, then Frankfurt's argument succeeds, shows that responsibility does not require alternatives, and the principle of alternate possibilities is refuted. But critics argue that truly flicker-free cases are impossible, that any case detailed enough to eliminate all flickers will either eliminate responsibility along with alternatives, or will preserve subtle flickers that defenders miss. And this back and forth, this attempt to construct and critique flicker-free cases, has dominated discussions of Frankfurt cases for decades, has generated increasingly technical papers, increasingly complex scenarios, and no consensus has emerged, and both sides claim victory, claim that the cases support their view, and the debate continues. The flicker of freedom also connects to debates about determinism and sourcehood, because if determinism is true, then flickers might not exist, might themselves be eliminated by deterministic causation, and so the flicker debate might ultimately depend on whether determinism is true, whether quantum indeterminacy provides space for genuine alternatives. And this makes the debate about flickers part of the larger debate about free will and determinism, about whether compatibilism or incompatibilism is correct. One response to the flicker argument accepts that flickers exist in Frankfurt cases, but denies that flickers ground responsibility, argues that the ability to begin an alternative that would immediately be stopped is not the kind of ability that matters for responsibility, is not genuine control, is not enough to make the action truly up to the agent, and responsibility requires more than flickers, requires robust alternatives, or requires source without alternatives. And flickers are too weak to do the work that alternate possibilities theorists need them to do. And Frankfurt's argument succeeds despite the flickers, because flickers are irrelevant to responsibility. Another response embraces flickers, argues that they show Frankfurt cases fail, show that alternatives are preserved, and this response modifies the principle of alternate possibilities to say that responsibility requires alternatives, but these alternatives need not be robust, need only be flickers, need only be the ability to begin alternatives even if not to complete them. And this modified principle is immune to Frankfurt's argument because Frankfurt cases contain flickers, and flicker-free cases either do not exist or do not preserve responsibility, and so the principle of alternate possibilities survives in modified form, survives as the principle that responsibility requires, at least flickers of freedom, requires some alternative possibilities, however minimal. The flicker debate also raises questions about what counts as an alternative, about how much control is required for something to be a genuine alternative, and these questions are central to understanding freedom, to specifying what free will requires, and the flicker debate, though technical, though focused on detailed cases, ultimately concerns fundamental issues about agency, control, and responsibility. And the debate has been productive, has forced clarification of concepts, has revealed complexity in notions that seemed simple, and whether flickers matter, whether they ground responsibility or are irrelevant, remains disputed, remains one of the many unresolved issues in the free will debate. Jones votes, the device does nothing. And somewhere in the process there is or is not a flicker, a moment where Jones could have begun differently, a tiny alternative that would have triggered intervention. And whether this flicker exists and whether it matters determine whether Frankfurt's argument succeeds. Whether responsibility requires alternatives and the flicker of freedom remains, tiny but potentially crucial, a last gasp of alternate possibilities in cases designed to eliminate them. And the debate continues, philosophers constructing ever more sophisticated cases, critics finding ever more subtle flickers, and the question persists, do flickers matter? Are tiny alternatives enough for responsibility? Or is responsibility about source, not alternatives? About where choices come from, not what else could have been chosen? And the flicker flickers, at the edge of possibility, barely existing, possibly necessary, and the debate around it endures. The false belief paradox. Young children, typically before the age of 4 or 5, exhibit a curious cognitive limitation. They struggle to understand that other people can hold beliefs that differ from reality, that someone can believe something false, and this limitation is revealed through false belief tasks, experimental scenarios designed to test whether children can represent the mental states of others, can understand that beliefs are representations that can be accurate or inaccurate, and the classic version involves a character named Maxie who places chocolate in a cupboard and then leaves the room. And while Maxie is gone, his mother moves the chocolate to a drawer. And when Maxie returns, children are asked where Maxie will look for the chocolate. And young children, those who have not yet developed what psychologists call theory of mind, say that Maxie will look in the drawer where the chocolate actually is, failing to recognize that Maxie's belief, formed when the chocolate was in the cupboard, has not been updated, that Maxie still believes the chocolate is in the cupboard even though this belief is now false. This failure to attribute false beliefs to others might seem like a simple developmental limitation, a matter of cognitive immaturity that children outgrow, but it raises deep philosophical questions about the nature of belief, the development of self-consciousness, the relationship between mind and world, and whether the ability to represent false beliefs is necessary for full-fledged thought and agency. And some philosophers have argued that the false belief paradox reveals something fundamental about the structure of cognition, that understanding false belief requires a kind of meta-representational ability, the capacity to represent representations, to think about thoughts, to hold in mind simultaneously what is the case and what someone believes to be the case. And this capacity emerges relatively late in development and may be unique to humans or shared only with a few other cognitively sophisticated species. The paradox takes its name from the tension between two facts. On the one hand, beliefs are defined by their representational content, by what they are about, and this content can be accurate or inaccurate, true or false. And so the possibility of false belief seems built into the very concept of belief, seems to be part of what makes beliefs different from mere sensations or reflexes. And on the other hand, young children seem unable to grasp this possibility, seem to treat beliefs as transparent to reality, as if what someone believes must be what is actually the case. And this suggests that the full concept of belief, the concept that includes the possibility of misrepresentation, is not innate but develops over time, requiring both cognitive maturation and social experience. The false belief paradox also appears in philosophical discussions of self-knowledge and first-person authority, because while young children struggle to attribute false beliefs to others, they seem to have access to their own beliefs in a more direct way. They can report what they believe without needing to infer it from evidence, and this asymmetry between first-person and third-person belief attribution raises questions about whether beliefs are fundamentally different when considered from the inside versus the outside. Whether self-knowledge is a special kind of knowledge with its own logic and epistemology, and whether the difficulty of understanding false belief in others reflects a deeper puzzle about how minds can be both transparent to themselves and opaque to others. Some philosophers have connected the false belief paradox to issues of rationality and akrasia, the puzzle of how someone can act against their own better judgment, can believe that an action is wrong or foolish, and yet perform it anyway, because understanding akrasia seems to require the ability to represent conflicting mental states, to hold in mind both what one judges to be best and what one is inclined to do, and this ability may depend on the same meta-representational capacity that underlies the understanding of false belief, the capacity to separate belief from reality, to recognize that mental states are states that can be at odds with each other or with the world. The false belief paradox also has implications for moral responsibility and the development of moral understanding, because attributing blame or praise to someone requires understanding their beliefs and intentions, requires recognizing that they acted based on what they believed rather than what was actually the case. And young children who cannot represent false beliefs also struggle with certain moral judgments. They tend to judge actions by their outcomes rather than by the intentions behind them, and they have difficulty understanding that someone who causes harm unintentionally, based on a false belief about the situation, is less blameworthy than someone who causes harm intentionally. And this connection between false belief understanding and moral judgment suggests that moral development depends on cognitive development, that certain moral concepts require certain cognitive capacities. The paradox raises questions about animal cognition as well, about whether non-human animals can represent false beliefs, whether they have theory of mind, and experiments with primates, corvids, and other intelligent species have produced mixed results. Some studies suggest that great apes and some birds can pass modified versions of false belief tasks, suggesting they have at least rudimentary theory of mind, while other studies find failures, and the debate continues about what these results mean, whether animals that pass simplified tasks really understand false belief, or whether they are using simpler heuristics, behavioral rules that mimic understanding without genuine meta-representation. The false belief paradox also connects to discussions of autism and neurodiversity, because individuals with autism often struggle with theory of mind tasks, including false belief tasks, even into adulthood, and this difficulty has been proposed as part of what makes social interaction challenging for autistic individuals. The inability to easily and automatically infer what others believe, intend, or know. And this has led to both therapeutic interventions designed to teach theory of mind skills and critiques of the emphasis on theory of mind, with some arguing that the focus on false belief tasks pathologizes a different cognitive style rather than a deficit, that autistic individuals may process social information differently rather than poorly, and that neurotypical people also struggle to understand autistic minds, suggesting that theory of mind failures are bidirectional, not one-sided. The paradox persists as a puzzle about the nature of mind and the development of mental concepts, about how humans come to understand that minds are representational, that beliefs can be false, that people act based on what they think rather than what is, and the failure of young children to grasp false belief reveals something profound about cognition, that the ability to represent misrepresentation is not simple or automatic, but requires a developmental achievement, a cognitive leap that transforms how we understand ourselves and others. And once this leap is made, once false belief becomes comprehensible, the social world opens up in new ways. Deception becomes possible and recognizable. Mistakes become understandable, different perspectives become appreciable, and the realization that others see the world differently, that their beliefs may not match reality or our own beliefs, becomes the foundation for empathy, communication, cooperation, and conflict. The chocolate sits in the drawer, Maxie believes it is in the cupboard, and the child must hold these two facts in mind simultaneously, must represent reality and represent Maxie's representation of reality, And for the young child, this is impossible. The two collapse into one, belief and reality merge, and Maxi must look where the chocolate is, not where he believes it to be. And the child's answer reveals a mind that has not yet learned to separate map from territory, representation from represented, belief from truth. And the false belief paradox marks the boundary between a simpler cognitive world where beliefs are transparent and a more complex one where beliefs are understood as representations that can misrepresent, where minds are recognized as fallible, limited, perspectival, and where the gap between how things seem and how things are becomes a permanent feature of the social and epistemic landscape. And we who have crossed this boundary, who can easily attribute false beliefs to others, can only dimly remember what it was like before, what it was like when belief and reality were not distinguished, when other minds were opaque in a different way, not because we understood them as different, but because we did not yet understand them as minds at all. The Euthyphro dilemma. Is murder wrong because God says so, or does God say so because it's wrong? In ancient Athens, a young man named Euthyphro encounters Socrates on the steps of the courthouse, and Euthyphro is prosecuting his own father for murder. And Socrates, ever curious, asks Euthyphro to explain what piety is, what makes an action holy or righteous. And Euthyphro confidently responds that pious actions are those loved by the gods, and impious actions are those hated by the gods. And Socrates, never satisfied with simple answers, poses a question that has echoed through philosophy and theology for over 2,000 years. He asks whether the gods love pious actions because those actions are pious, or whether actions are pious because the gods love them. And this question, now called the Euthyphro dilemma, presents a fundamental challenge to divine command theory. The view that morality depends on God's will, that actions are right or wrong because God commands or forbids them. And the dilemma forces a choice between two uncomfortable options, each with troubling implications for the relationship between God and morality. Imagine the first horn of the dilemma. Suppose that actions are good because God commands them, that rightness is simply whatever God says is right, and wrongness is whatever God forbids, and there is no independent standard of goodness, no morality that exists prior to or apart from God's commands. And God could have commanded anything, could have made murder obligatory and charity forbidden, could have declared torture virtuous and compassion wicked, and whatever God commanded would be right by definition. And this seems to make morality arbitrary, seems to empty moral terms of their content. Because if good just means commanded by God, then saying God commands what is good becomes a tautology, becomes equivalent to saying God commands what God commands, which is trivial, tells us nothing, and more troublingly, this view seems to undermine the idea that God is good, because if goodness is defined by God's commands, then calling God good just means God does what God commands, which again is trivial, and we lose the ability to praise God's goodness as something meaningful, as something that transcends mere consistency with divine will. Visualize a world where this view is true, where morality is purely a matter of divine fiat, and God announces new commandments, declares that from now on, stealing is virtuous and honesty is sin, and according to divine command theory, this announcement would make stealing right and honesty wrong, because rightness just is whatever God says, and we would be obligated to become thieves, obligated to lie. And this seems absurd, seems to violate our deepest moral intuitions, because we feel that stealing and lying are wrong for reasons that have nothing to do with commands, that they harm people, violate trust, undermine cooperation, and these reasons would exist even if God commanded otherwise, and so morality seems to have a structure, a logic that cannot be altered by divine decree. And this suggests that the first horn of the dilemma is unacceptable, that we should reject the idea that actions are good merely because God commands them. Now consider the second horn. Suppose that God commands actions because those actions are good, that there is an independent standard of goodness, a moral truth that exists prior to God's commands. And God, being perfectly good and perfectly wise, recognizes this moral truth and commands accordingly. And God commands charity because charity is good, forbids murder because murder is bad, and the goodness and badness exist independently of the commands. And this seems more plausible, seems to preserve the meaningfulness of moral language and the praiseworthiness of God's goodness. But it creates a different problem, because if moral truth is independent of God, then God is not the ultimate source of morality. God does not create right and wrong, but merely recognizes and reveals them. And there is something above God, a standard of goodness to which even God is subject. And this seems to limit God's sovereignty, seems to place constraints on divine power and authority. And many theologians find this unacceptable, argue that nothing can be above God, that God is the ultimate reality, the ground of all being, and making morality independent of God seems to dethrone God, to reduce God to a mere messenger of moral truths that exist on their own. The dilemma presents a forced choice: either accept that morality is arbitrary, dependent on God's will, capable of being anything God decrees, or accept that morality is independent of God, existing prior to divine commands, limiting God's sovereignty. And neither option is attractive to believers who want to say both that God is the source of morality and that God's commands reflect genuine moral truth rather than arbitrary preference. And various theological and philosophical responses have been proposed over the centuries, attempting to escape between the horns to find a position that preserves both divine sovereignty and moral objectivity. One response associated with medieval theologians like Duns Scotus embraces the first horn, accepts that morality depends entirely on God's will, and bites the bullet on arbitrariness, arguing that God's commands are not arbitrary in any problematic sense because God is perfectly rational and benevolent. And while God could have commanded otherwise, God would never do so. And God's nature ensures that divine commands will align with what promotes flourishing and well-being. And so while morality is ultimately grounded in God's will, it is not random or capricious. And this response tries to have it both ways, tries to say that morality depends on God's will, but is still stable and reasonable because God's character is stable and reasonable. But critics argue that this just pushes the problem back, because now we are saying God's character is good. And what does good mean here? If goodness is defined by God's will, then saying God's character is good is circular. And if goodness is independent, then we are back on the second horn. Another response associated with Aquinas and natural law theory embraces the second horn but softens it, argues that moral truth is not independent of God but is part of God's nature, is rooted in the divine essence, and God's commands reflect God's eternal nature rather than arbitrary choices. And goodness is not external to God but internal, is what God is, and God commands what is good because God is goodness itself. And this unites God and morality, makes them inseparable, avoids both arbitrariness and external constraint. But critics argue that this is just wordplay, that if moral truth is part of God's nature, then it is still independent in the relevant sense, still not something God creates or controls, and the question remains whether God could have had a different nature. And if so, we are back to arbitrariness. And if not, then something constrains God's nature, something makes God's nature what it is, and we are back to external constraints. A third response from some modern philosophers rejects the dilemma entirely, argues that it presents a false choice, that it assumes moral realism, assumes that moral truths exist objectively, either dependent on God or independent, but perhaps moral truth is neither. Perhaps morality is a human construction, a set of norms we create to facilitate cooperation, and God's role is to guide this construction, to reveal which norms best serve human flourishing, and this avoids both horns by denying the assumption that moral truth exists in any absolute sense. But it creates new problems makes morality relative or subjective, undermines the claim that moral truths are objective facts that God knows and humans can discover, and many find this solution worse than the original dilemma. The Euthyphro dilemma appears not just in theology, but in secular ethics as well, because any attempt to ground morality in authority faces the same structure. If we say actions are right because society approves them, we can ask whether society approves them because they are right, or whether they are right because society approves them. And the dilemma recurs: arbitrariness on one side, independent moral truth on the other. And the same choice must be faced. And this suggests that the dilemma is not specifically about God, but about the relationship between authority and morality, about whether moral truth can be grounded in will, in decision, in command, or whether it must exist independently of any authority, answerable to reason, or nature, or some other source. Socrates stands on the courthouse steps, questioning Euthyphro, probing the foundations of piety, and the young man's confidence wavers. His simple answer unravels, and the dilemma emerges, stark and unavoidable. And 25 centuries later, the question remains: does God command the good because it is good, or is it good because God commands it? And theologians and philosophers continue to debate, continue to propose solutions, continue to struggle with a choice that seems to force a sacrifice: either God's sovereignty or morality's objectivity, either divine authority or moral truth. And the dilemma persists, unresolved, a permanent fixture in philosophy of religion, a challenge to anyone who wants to ground ethics in divine will, and a reminder that even the most fundamental questions about the source of right and wrong, about the relationship between God and goodness, about whether morality is created or discovered, remain open, remain contested. And the young Euthyphro walks away confused, and Socrates continues to question, and the dilemma remains, waiting to challenge every new generation of believers and philosophers who confront the ancient problem of how God and morality relate. The consequence argument: why the past makes your future inevitable. A philosopher constructs a deceptively simple argument about free will and determinism, an argument that has become one of the most influential and most discussed arguments in the free will debate. And the argument is called the consequence argument, formulated most clearly by Peter van Inwagen. And the argument aims to show that free will is incompatible with determinism, that if determinism is true, then no one has free will, that our actions are not genuinely up to us but are consequences of the past and the laws of nature, things we cannot control. And the argument proceeds through careful reasoning about what we can and cannot control, about what is and is not up to us, and it concludes that if the past and the laws determine everything, then we determine nothing. We have no control. We are not free. And this is the consequence argument, an argument for incompatibilism, for the view that determinism and free will cannot both be true, and the argument forces compatibilists to explain how we could be free if determinism is true, how our actions could be up to us if they are inevitable consequences of factors beyond our control. And the debate sparked by this argument continues, with philosophers proposing responses, defending premises, clarifying concepts, and the consequence argument remains central to contemporary discussions of free will, a challenge that every theory must address. Imagine the logical structure. Determinism says that the state of the world at any time, plus the laws of nature, entail the state of the world at all future times. Everything that happens is a consequence of what happened before, plus the laws. And now consider your action right now. Reading these words, and if determinism is true, then this action is entailed by the state of the world before you were born, plus the laws of nature, and you have no control over the state of the world before you were born. You did not cause it. You cannot change it. It is a fixed fact about the past, and you have no control over the laws of nature. You did not create them. You cannot alter them. They are what they are, independent of you. And if your action is entailed by things you have no control over, then you have no control over your action. And if you have no control over your action, then you are not free with respect to that action. And this applies to all your actions. All are consequences of the past and the laws, things beyond your control. And so if determinism is true, then you are not free. You have no free will. And this is the consequence argument in its essential form. The argument can be stated more formally using the concept of power, what we have power over, what is up to us. And the argument says that no one has power over the past, no one has power over the laws of nature, no one has power over the fact that the past and the laws entail the present. And therefore, by a transfer principle, if the present is entailed by things we have no power over, then we have no power over the present. And having power over our actions is necessary for free will, and so we lack free will. If determinism is true, and the argument is valid, the conclusion follows from the premises. And so attacking the argument requires attacking one of the premises, requires either denying that we lack power over the past and laws, which seems implausible, or denying the transfer principle, denying that lack of power transfers across entailment. Visualize the causal chain, stretching back into the past, the state of the universe billions of years ago, plus the laws of physics, determined the state 1 second later, and that state, plus the laws determined the next state. And the chain continues, moment by moment, through the formation of galaxies and stars and planets, through the evolution of life, through human history, through your birth and upbringing and this present moment. And at no point in this chain did you have control. You were not there at the beginning. You did not set the initial conditions. You did not write the laws, and the entire chain was set in motion before you existed. And your current action is the end of this chain, is the inevitable consequence of factors you did not control. And the consequence argument says, this shows you are not free. Your action was not genuinely up to you, was determined by the past. Compatibilists respond to the consequence argument in various ways. One response denies the transfer principle, argues that lack of power does not transfer across entailment in the way the argument assumes, that you can have power over a fact even if that fact is entailed by other facts you have no power over. And this response requires specifying what power means, what it is to have something be up to you. And compatibilists argue that an action is up to you if it results from your deliberation, your desires, your character, even if those psychological states were themselves determined by the past. And so the transfer principle is false. Power does not transfer, and the consequence argument fails. Another compatibilist response accepts the transfer principle, but denies that we lack power over the past in the relevant sense, argues that we do have a kind of counterfactual power over the past. We have the power such that if we had chosen differently, then the past would have been different. And this counterfactual power is sufficient for freedom, sufficient for the action to be up to us. And critics respond that counterfactual power is not real power, that being such that if you acted differently, the past would have been different is not the same as being able to act differently. And the compatibilist response confuses conditional ability with genuine ability, confuses what would have happened if things were different with what you can make happen. A third compatibilist response distinguishes between freedom and ultimate responsibility, accepts that the consequence argument shows we lack ultimate responsibility, ultimate control, the kind of control that would make us solely and completely responsible for our actions independent of all prior causes, but argues that we have enough control, enough freedom, for moral responsibility, for being proper subjects of praise and blame. And ultimate responsibility is impossible, is not required for the ordinary kind of responsibility that matters for ethics and law. And the consequence argument shows too much, shows that even libertarians who reject determinism cannot have ultimate responsibility because their actions are either caused by prior states or are random, and neither causation nor randomness gives ultimate responsibility. And so, the consequence argument does not distinguish between compatibilism and libertarianism, does not favour incompatibilism over compatibilism. Incompatibilists defend the consequence argument, defend the transfer principle, argue that compatibilist responses involve sophisticated verbal tricks, redefine freedom in ways that evacuate it of meaning, and the consequence argument reveals that if determinism is true, then we are not truly in control, are not genuinely free, and moral responsibility is undermined. And we must either reject determinism or accept that free will is an illusion, and different incompatibilists choose differently. Some become libertarians and argue that determinism is false, that quantum mechanics or agent causation or emergent properties provide room for free will, and others become hard determinists and accept that free will does not exist, that responsibility is problematic, that praise and blame need reinterpretation. The consequence argument also generates discussions about the fixity of the past, about what it means to say we have no power over the past. Because in one sense this is obvious. We cannot change what has already happened, cannot make it the case that the past was different. But in another sense, our current actions do affect what the past was, because if we act differently now, then the past must have been different given determinism. And so there is a sense in which our actions constrain the past, and compatibilists exploit this to argue that we do have power over the past in the relevant sense, while incompatibilists insist that this is not real power, not the kind of control required for freedom. The argument stands at the centre of free will debates, forces clarification of concepts, forces philosophers to specify what freedom requires, what control means, what power involves, and whether these are compatible with determinism, and the debate is productive, generates insight, even if it does not generate consensus, and the consequence argument remains one of the most powerful arguments for incompatibilism. One of the most difficult challenges for compatibilists to answer, and Van Inwagen's formulation is elegant, is compelling, captures a deep intuition that if everything we do is the inevitable consequence of factors beyond our control, then we are not truly free and the past stretches back, determined and fixed, and the laws operate, inexorable and unchanging, and the present unfolds and the action occurs, and the consequence argument says, this action was not free, was not genuinely up to the agent, was a consequence of things beyond control, and whether this argument succeeds, whether compatibilists can answer it, remains disputed, remains central to contemporary philosophy of free will. The crocodile dilemma, when a monster's promise makes truth deadly. A crocodile seizes a child from the riverbank, snatches the infant in its jaws, and the mother screams and begs for her child's return, and the crocodile, cunning and cruel, makes an offer. The crocodile says, I will return your child if you correctly predict what I will do, if you say truly whether I will return the child or not, and the mother must choose, must predict the crocodile's action, and if she predicts correctly, she gets her child back, and if she predicts incorrectly, the crocodile keeps the child. And this seems straightforward at first, seems like a gamble with 50-50 odds. But the mother is clever, thinks carefully, and realizes she can construct a prediction that creates a paradox. And she says to the crocodile, you will not return my child. And now the crocodile faces an impossible choice, a logical trap from which there is no escape. And this is the crocodile dilemma, an ancient paradox from Greek and Roman philosophy that illustrates how self-reference and promises can generate contradictions that have no resolution. Imagine the crocodile processing the mother's prediction. She has said, the crocodile will not return the child, and the crocodile must decide whether this prediction is true or false. And if the prediction is true, then the crocodile will not return the child, but the promise was to return the child. If the prediction is correct, and the prediction is correct, so the crocodile must return the child. But returning the child makes the prediction false, because the prediction said the child would not be returned. And if the prediction is false, then the crocodile is not obligated to return the child, but not returning the child makes the prediction true. And if it is true, the crocodile must return the child, and the cycle repeats. And the crocodile is stuck, unable to act, unable to fulfill the promise without violating it, unable to violate it without fulfilling it, and the paradox is complete. Visualize the crocodile frozen at the water's edge, jaws clamped around the child, mind caught in a logical loop, every option leading to contradiction, and the mother waits, and the crocodile cannot move forward or backward, cannot return the child or keep the child without creating impossibility. And the promise that seemed simple, seemed like a straightforward conditional, has become a trap, has revealed that some promises are unkeepable, some conditionals are incoherent when their conditions refer to their own fulfillment. The dilemma is structurally similar to the liar paradox, involves self-reference creating contradiction, because the mother's prediction refers to the crocodile's action, and the crocodile's action depends on whether the prediction is true, and the prediction's truth depends on the action. And this circular dependency creates a situation where no consistent assignment of truth values is possible, where any choice by the crocodile contradicts the conditions of the promise. And the paradox shows that not all promises can be kept, not all conditionals can be satisfied, especially when the condition refers to the action that depends on the condition. One proposed resolution is that the crocodile's promise is defective, is not a genuine promise, but a linguistic trick, because promises must be performable, must create obligations that can be fulfilled, and the crocodile's promise creates an obligation that cannot be fulfilled when the mother makes the strategic prediction, and so the promise is void. The crocodile is not bound by it, and the crocodile can do whatever it chooses without violating any obligation, and by this resolution, the crocodile keeps the child. The mother loses. Not because her prediction was wrong, but because she made a prediction that made the promise unenforceable, and the dilemma is resolved by rejecting the premise that the promise binds the crocodile in paradoxical cases. Another resolution distinguishes between the crocodile's intentions at the moment of making the promise and the actual outcome, and argues that the promise should be interpreted as concerning the crocodile's intended action, not the final action after considering the prediction, and when the mother predicts the child will not be returned, the crocodile evaluates whether to intend to return the child, and if the crocodile's initial intention is not to return the child, then the prediction is correct, and the crocodile should return the child according to the promise. And this return action does not create a contradiction, because the promise was about the intention, not about the final action. But this resolution seems strained, seems to reinterpret the promise in ways that were not clearly intended. And it is not obvious that distinguishing intention from action resolves the paradox or merely shifts it. A third resolution embraces the paradox and argues that it shows the limits of what can be promised, that some conditionals are inherently problematic, that promises whose conditions involve self-reference or depend on the promiser's response to the condition create logical tangles that cannot be resolved, and rational agents should avoid making such promises, should recognize that not every grammatically well-formed conditional statement creates a genuine obligation, and the crocodile's mistake was offering a promise whose structure allowed paradoxical predictions. And once the paradox emerges, the crocodile is released from the promise, is in a situation where any action is permissible because no action can satisfy the promise, and morality and logic give no guidance. The crocodile dilemma also illustrates issues in game theory and strategic reasoning, because the mother is using her prediction strategically, choosing her words not to convey her genuine belief about what the crocodile will do, but to create a situation where the crocodile cannot win. And this strategic use of language, using predictions not to predict, but to constrain, appears in negotiations, legal arguments, and political discourse, where statements are crafted to create binds, to force opponents into positions where any response is disadvantageous, and the dilemma shows that self-referential statements can be weapons, can be used to trap others in paradoxes where no good option exists. The dilemma has modern variants involving computers and artificial intelligence, where programs might be given instructions that are self-referential, that depend on the program's own output in ways that create paradox, and programmers must be careful to avoid such loops, must ensure that conditionals do not refer to their own evaluation in ways that create infinite regress or contradiction. And the crocodile dilemma serves as a warning, a reminder that self-reference is dangerous, creates problems that cannot always be resolved by cleverness or by trying harder, but only by recognizing the structure and avoiding it. The child hangs in the crocodile's jaws. The mother waits for an answer, and the crocodile is paralyzed by logic, cannot move without contradiction, and the ancient paradox remains, unsolved, unresolvable, a trap that philosophy has not escaped, a reminder that language can create impossibilities, that promises can be unkeepable, that self-reference generates paradoxes that defy solution, and the crocodile dilemma endures, taught in logic classes, discussed in philosophy seminars, a vivid example of how words can bind more tightly than chains, how a simple promise can become an impossible obligation, and how the combination of self-reference and conditionality creates contradictions from which there is no escape, and the crocodile remains frozen, the child unclaimed, and the paradox persists, waiting at the riverbank for the next clever victim to spring the trap. The Monty Hall problem. A game show host presents 3 doors. Behind one is a valuable prize, a car perhaps, and behind the other 2 are less desirable outcomes, goats or some other consolation, and the contestant chooses a door, say, door number 1, but before the chosen door is opened, the host, who knows what is behind each door, opens one of the other doors, revealing a goat, and now 2 doors remain closed. The one the contestant originally chose, and one other, and the host offers a choice, stick with the original selection or switch to the other unopened door, and the question that has baffled and frustrated countless people is simple. Does it matter? Is there an advantage to switching? And the answer, counterintuitive as it seems, is yes. Switching doubles the probability of winning, changing the odds from 1 in 3 to 2 in 3. And this result violates most people's intuitions. Seems wrong? Feels like it cannot be right? Yet it is mathematically certain. And this is the Monty Hall problem, named after the host of the American television game show Let's Make a Deal, a puzzle, improbability that reveals how poorly human intuition handles conditional probability and how easily we can be misled by seemingly simple scenarios. The reasoning behind the correct answer goes as follows. When the contestant first chooses a door, the probability that the prize is behind that door is 1 in 3, and the probability that it is behind one of the other 2 doors is 2 in 3. And this much is uncontroversial. But when the host opens one of the other doors and reveals a goat, showing that the prize is not behind that door, the probabilities do not redistribute evenly among the remaining doors. The original choice still has a 1 in 3 probability of being correct because the host's action did not change the fact that the contestant's initial choice was made with 1 in 3 odds. But the other unopened door now has a 2 in 3 probability because the 2 in 3 chance that was distributed across the 2 unchosen doors is now concentrated in the single remaining door, and so switching to that door doubles the chance of winning. The intuition that misleads most people is the idea that once one door is opened and eliminated, there are 2 doors left, and the prize is equally likely to be behind either, giving a 50-50 chance regardless of whether you switch. But this reasoning ignores the information provided by the host's action, the fact that the host deliberately chose to open a door with a goat. And this deliberate choice is not random, it is constrained by knowledge. The host cannot open the door with the prize and will not open the door the contestant chose. And so the host's action provides information that updates the probabilities in a non-obvious way. A useful way to see why switching is advantageous is to imagine a version of the game with 1,000,000 doors. The contestant chooses one door, which has a 1 in a million chance of having the prize, and then the host opens 999,998 of the other doors, all showing goats, leaving only the contestant's original choice and one other door. And now it seems clear that the contestant's original choice, made with 1 in a million odds, is almost certainly wrong. And the remaining door, the one the host carefully avoided opening, is almost certainly the one with the prize, and switching gives a 999,999 in a million chance of winning. And the same principle applies with 3 doors, just with less dramatic numbers. The Monty Hall problem has been a source of controversy and heated debate, even among mathematicians and statisticians. And when Marilyn Vos Savant, a columnist known for her high IQ, published the correct answer in her magazine column in 1990, she received thousands of letters, many from PhD holders and professionals, insisting she was wrong. And the controversy revealed how deeply counterintuitive the solution is, how resistant people are to accepting it even when presented with mathematical proof. And this resistance reflects broader features of human cognition. The tendency to rely on heuristics and intuitions that work well in most everyday situations, but fail in probabilistic scenarios involving conditional information. The problem also illustrates the importance of conditioning in probability, the fact that probabilities must be updated in light of new information, and that the way information is acquired matters. The host's knowledge and deliberate choice of which door to open is crucial to the solution. If the host opened a door randomly and happened to reveal a goat, then the probabilities would indeed be 50-50. But because the host knows and deliberately avoids the prize door, the situation is different. And this distinction between random and informed selection is subtle and easy to miss. The Monty Hall problem has applications beyond game shows. It appears in medical testing, in legal reasoning, in machine learning, anywhere that probabilities must be updated based on partial information. And understanding the logic of the Monty Hall problem helps clarify how to reason correctly in these more consequential contexts, how to avoid fallacies, how to properly incorporate evidence into probability assessments. The problem also raises questions about the psychology of probability, about why people find certain probabilistic reasoning so difficult. And experiments have shown that even after being told the correct answer and shown simulations that demonstrate it, many people remain skeptical, unable to shake the intuition that switching makes no difference. And this persistence of false intuition, despite evidence, suggests that probabilistic thinking is not natural to humans, that we evolved in environments where simple heuristics like equiprobability were sufficient, and that the kind of careful conditional reasoning required by the Monty Hall problem is a learned skill that requires training and practice. The doors stand closed, one hides the prize, the host knows which. The contestant chooses. The host opens a door, reveals a goat, and offers the choice. And the decision, which seems inconsequential, which feels like a coin flip, is actually a test of probabilistic reasoning, a puzzle that most people get wrong, that defies intuition, that reveals the gap between how we think probability works and how it actually works. And the Monty Hall problem endures, a staple of probability courses, a cautionary tale about trusting intuition, a reminder that the world is full of situations where the obvious answer is wrong, where careful analysis reveals unexpected structure, where what seems like chance is actually determined by hidden information, and the contestant who switches, who overcomes intuition and follows the mathematics, walks away with the prize twice as often, and the contestant who sticks with the original choice, trusting gut instinct, wins only a third of the time. And the difference, the doubling of odds, is not a trick or a gimmick, but a genuine feature of how conditional probability operates, and the problem persists, puzzling new generations frustrating those who encounter it, illuminating those who understand it. A small puzzle with large implications. A game show scenario that contains lessons about reasoning, evidence, and the limits of human intuition. The omnipotence paradox. Can God create a rock so heavy that God cannot lift it? A theologian proclaims that God is omnipotent, all-powerful, able to do anything, and this claim is central to many religious traditions. Reflects the idea that God is unlimited, unconstrained, the ultimate being with ultimate power, and yet a simple question reveals a logical puzzle, a challenge to the coherence of omnipotence. And the question asks whether God can create a rock so heavy that God cannot lift it. And this question seems innocent, but it creates a dilemma. Because if God can create such a rock, then there is something God cannot do, namely, lift the rock. And so God is not omnipotent. And if God cannot create such a rock, then again, there is something God cannot do, namely, create the unliftable rock. And so again, God is not omnipotent. And either way, omnipotence seems impossible, seems self-contradictory, and this is the omnipotence paradox, also called the stone paradox, a puzzle that has troubled theologians and philosophers for centuries, forcing them to clarify what omnipotence means, what powers an all-powerful being could and could not have, and whether the concept of omnipotence is even coherent. Imagine the scenario concretely. God stands in a cosmic workshop, materials at hand, ready to create. And God decides to make a rock, but not just any rock. A rock so massive, so heavy, so immovable that even God's infinite power cannot lift it. And God sets to work, shaping matter, compressing mass, until the rock is complete. And then God tries to lift it, and the rock does not budge. God pulls and pushes and exerts all divine force, but the rock remains on the ground, unliftable. And this seems to show that God is not omnipotent, because there is something God cannot do, cannot lift this particular rock. And yet if God never creates the rock, if God admits that creating such a rock is impossible, then this also shows God is not omnipotent, because there is something God cannot create. And the paradox presents a forced choice. Neither option preserves omnipotence, and the concept seems to collapse under its own logic. The paradox can be generalized beyond rocks. The question could be whether God can create a task so difficult that God cannot complete it, whether God can create a being so powerful that God cannot control it, whether God can make a rule so binding that God cannot break it, and in each case the same structure emerges. Either God can create the limiting thing, in which case God is limited by it, or God cannot create it, in which case God is limited by the inability to create it. And either way, God's power has boundaries, and omnipotence seems impossible. And this suggests that omnipotence might be an incoherent concept, might not be logically possible, might be like a square circle or a married bachelor, something that sounds meaningful but actually combines contradictory ideas and cannot exist. Theologians and philosophers have developed several responses to the paradox, attempting to show that omnipotence is coherent and that the paradox rests on misunderstandings or ambiguities. One common response is to restrict omnipotence to logically possible tasks, to say that God can do anything that is logically possible but cannot do things that are logically impossible, and creating a rock that an omnipotent being cannot lift is logically impossible, is self-contradictory, because omnipotence includes the ability to lift anything, and so a rock that cannot be lifted by an omnipotent being is a logical impossibility, like a square circle. And God's inability to create logical impossibilities does not limit God's power in any meaningful sense, because logical impossibilities are not real tasks, are not things that could be done. And so excluding them from the scope of omnipotence is not a limitation but a clarification. Visualize omnipotence as a set of powers: the power to create anything logically possible, the power to know anything knowable, the power to do anything doable. And the set does not include impossible things, does not include making square circles or creating married bachelors, or lifting unliftable rocks. Because these are not tasks, are not possibilities, are just combinations of words that do not refer to any coherent state of affairs. And just as we do not think a mathematician is limited because they cannot prove that 2 + 2 = 5, we should not think God is limited because God cannot do logically impossible things, because these are not things, are not genuine constraints on power. Another response distinguishes between God's essential attributes and God's contingent choices, and argues that omnipotence means God has the power to do anything consistent with God's nature. And part of God's nature is being omnipotent, and so God cannot create a situation where God lacks omnipotence, because that would contradict God's nature. But this is not a limitation on God's power. It is a feature of what God is. And just as God cannot make God not exist, because God is a necessary being, God cannot make God not omnipotent, because omnipotence is essential to God. And the rock scenario asks God to create a contradiction, to remain omnipotent while becoming not omnipotent, and this is incoherent. And God's inability to do it reflects logical necessity, not weakness. A third response embraces the paradox and argues that it shows omnipotence is paradoxical, is not a coherent concept, and rather than defending omnipotence, we should acknowledge that God's power, while immense, is not literally unlimited, that there are things God cannot do, and this is not a defect in God but a recognition that power, like any concept, has logical limits. And some religious traditions, particularly in Eastern philosophy, are comfortable with divine paradoxes, with the idea that ultimate reality transcends logical categories, and the paradox of omnipotence is just one of many paradoxes that arise when finite human concepts are applied to the infinite divine. The paradox also appears in discussions of free will and divine foreknowledge, because if God knows the future infallibly, then God knows what choices humans will make. And if God knows what choices humans will make, then humans cannot choose otherwise, because if they could, then God's knowledge would be wrong, and so divine omniscience seems to eliminate human free will. And this creates a dilemma similar to the omnipotence paradox. Either God is not omniscient, does not know future free choices, or humans are not free, do not have genuine choice. And both options are unpalatable to many theologians who want to preserve both divine perfection and human freedom. And various solutions have been proposed, involving timeless knowledge, middle knowledge, open theism, but none has won universal acceptance, and the tension remains. The omnipotence paradox reveals that the concept of unlimited power is more complex than it first appears, that power operates within logical and conceptual constraints, and that saying God is all-powerful does not mean God can do literally anything we can describe in words, but only that God can do anything that is genuinely possible, anything that makes sense. And the paradox serves as a test case, forces clarification of what omnipotence means, pushes theologians to be precise about divine attributes, and shows that even the most basic theological claims require careful, philosophical analysis to be made coherent. God stands before the rock, or does not create the rock, and the paradox hangs in the air, a logical puzzle about power and limits, about possibility and coherence, and the answer depends on how omnipotence is defined, on whether logical impossibilities are excluded, on whether God's nature places constraints on divine action. And different traditions answer differently. Some saying God transcends logic, some saying logic constrains even God. And the omnipotence paradox remains, not fully resolved, still debated, still used to challenge and clarify theological concepts. And the rock sits there, hypothetical and impossible, a monument to the difficulties of thinking clearly about ultimate power, about infinite abilities, about what it means to say God can do anything. And the paradox persists, elegant and troubling, a reminder that even divine attributes, even the powers of an unlimited being, must answer to logic, must cohere, must make sense. and that the concept of omnipotence, for all its simplicity, conceals depths and difficulties that philosophy continues to explore.